to our event from Baku to Brazil. Key takeaways from COP29 and the road to COP30. We are here today with the support of the Salata Institute for Climate and Sustainability here at Harvard University. I'm Joe Aldi, I'm a professor on the faculty here at the Harvard Kennedy School. I also serve as the chair of the Faculty Steering Committee for the Climate Action Accelerator at the Salata Institute. It is my pleasure to host this discussion on the most recent climate change talks. I'm thrilled to be joined by faculty and students who are expert on today's conversation. Starting on the far end, we have Adarsh Kumar, who is an NPP student at the Harvard Kennedy School and an MBA student at MIT Sloan. This was the first time Adarsh had attended a COP. He was in Baku recently. Immediately next to me is Rob Stavens, the A.J. Meyer Professor of Energy and Economic Development at the Harvard Kennedy School and the Director of the Harvard Project on Climate Agreements. Professor Stavens has attended every COP except for one since 2007 in Bali. In attending these, he's often engaged with negotiators, stakeholders, the media, to share the latest insights and evidence from the work of the Harvard Project on Climate Agreements that he directs. You have Catherine Wolfram, the William Barton Rogers Professor in Energy at MIT Sloan, and she's also the co-director of the Harvard-MIT Global Climate Policy Project, a new joint effort that she's leading with our colleague Dustin Tingley, who's joined at HKS and the government department here at Harvard, and I'm happy to say with me. Catherine served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Climate and Energy Economics at the U.S. Treasury for the first 2 years of the Biden administration. And while she did not travel to Baku, she has been a past COP attendee and maybe made a wise decision of traveling to Barbados instead to discuss climate change this fall. We'll get to that in a few minutes. And then finally, we have Angela Zhang. Angela is a senior at Harvard College who is studying economics and environmental science and public policy. She's attended the past 4 COPs. And if you've checked out her website, you'll find that she has met and interviewed a number of the leading lights working on climate, whether it's Al Gore, the UN Secretary General, and more. So we look forward to hearing about some of those experiences in a moment, Angela. Before we get started, let me note for everyone's benefit that we are recording this session and we will post it later on the Salata Institute's YouTube channel. I'll open the session with some questions for our panelists, and then we'll take some of your questions before we wrap up later this morning. So last month, the parties to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, basically every country in the world, met in Baku for the 29th Conference of the Parties, the annual climate change talk sponsored by the United Nations. The talks, though, are much more than simply getting together the negotiating staffs of various foreign ministries to talk about what should be the text of some decision governing implementation of the UNFCCC. So to give us a sense of how big a party or how big a circus, how big an expo it is, let me first turn to Professor Stavens. Rob, could you share with us the various elements of the COP and what you found as sort of the key elements of this year in Baku?
Well, there's something that's interesting and actually almost unique about the international agreement, the umbrella agreement, which is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change from 1992. Unique among international agreements, and that is it provides an explicit role for what you could think of as members of the public, people from civil society. There's a provision in the UNFCCC itself that these people are to be welcomed as, in a sense, participants every year at the annual conference of the parties. And when I first went to the COPs in Bali with you, 17 or 18 years ago, I would say that 80% or 90% of the meaningful action were within the negotiations, the official government delegations. And then there were the hangers-on from environmental NGOs, trade associations, universities, etc., us. And that's not where the real action was. It's evolved over time and then accelerated over the last 5 years, so that now, with the exception of those years in which there's a new international agreement, such as Kyoto in 1997 or Paris in 2015, with the exception of those years, I'd say that 85 to 90% of the meaningful action, what's really going on, is not the negotiations, it's rather this periphery. So the sideshows have become the main event, which is why I called it the last few years Climate Expo 2023 or Climate Expo 2024. And I don't mean to denigrate it in saying that, because I think that the annual climate talks have a lot more in common with the annual get-together in Davos in Switzerland, where some of us have been. And that is that it's very much a bottom-up procedure. It's not as if the corporate CEOs get together in Davos, negotiate what they're going to do, and then they go home and tell the board of directors what the company has to do. The causality is, of course, in the opposite direction. And that's essentially the way the annual climate talks are. So it's a bottom-up process. It's a way to get together. People go because other people are going to be there, and that's that's a self-fulfilling equilibrium, it turns out. And this most recent COP was not an exception to that in Baku. A lot of what's interesting and meaningful are the arrangements that go on and around their periphery, even when it's among governments. So for example, the global methane pledge, which is intergovernmental, is nothing to do, it's not part of the Paris Agreement, it's not officially part of the UNFCCC. That's something that the US and Europe initiated, now other countries have joined, but it's really outside of the official talks.
Great, thanks. Angela, let me turn to you next. Could you give us an example of something that stood out to you from your time in Baku for this Climate Expo, as Professor Stevens describes it?
Yeah, definitely. As Professor Stevens mentioned, there is definitely a sideshow, and I am most certainly part of that section and not the negotiations, but some things that stood out to me. One, there were actually a lot more young people who were part of negotiating delegations, which is really a great sight to see. Second, I think I also saw, at least following the youth perspective, a lot more children involved, because I think UNICEF has been trying to push this intergenerational dialogue by bringing them along. And so I think that wasn't something I was necessarily expecting to see as much this year, but that was definitely present as well in terms of youth participation and mobilization. Outside of that, I think there were a lot of more regional commitments, like the shipping decarbonization goals. So I think that's sort of in line with what we were talking about with regards to the methane pledge not being something that's centrally governed, but rather something that comes up through a lot of people in the same room at the same time.
Great, thanks. Now, Josh, let me turn to you next. This was your first time at a UN Climate Talks. You had a number of opportunities to meet with negotiators, so sort of staff-level negotiators, as well as a few ministers from various governments. What do you see as sort of the key takeaways you had from these conversations?
Yeah, firstly, what an honor to be part of this esteemed panel. I think I have the best seat in the house to listen to all your insights, and thank you to the Slaughter Institute. I think one of the themes that stood out for me, of course, this was the finance COP, but looking towards Belém, there's a lot of conversation on food. And so Baku is the finance COP, Belém is being pitched as the food systems COP. So I was fortunate enough to be there in Baku during the Food and Agriculture Day. There's a thematic day focused on food and agriculture, but even on other days, there were a phenomenal number of conversations from negotiators, from ministers, and from folks in the periphery, from multilateral development banks and private organizations, about the importance of food systems, both in the mitigation context, but increasingly more and more in the adaptation context. With new climate realities sort of sinking in, how do we ensure that yields are still robust so that we can feed our people? So one of the sort of points that I want to mention here is Baku in the food and agriculture context was really a continuity COP. UAE COP was very significant in its declaration on sustainable agriculture. There's a great amount of focus in the declaration on building in adaptation and resilience in the agriculture context, agriculture becoming a big part of countries' national determined contributions that we will see more and more of as more and more countries publish their NDCs in the upcoming months. So looking forward to Belém, which is hosted by Brazil, which is a big leader in agriculture. They released their NDCs. There's a big focus on agriculture in the NDCs. UAE also, despite not being as big a player in the agriculture sort of ecosystem, has pledged to reduce its agriculture sector emissions by around 40% by 2035. So looking forward to Belém, that's one key theme that stood out for me is food and agriculture, and how do we make progress on that?
Great. So, Catherine, we've heard that this is the finance COP, a point I want to get back to in a moment. But we've also heard about, as a part of this kind of climate expo, discussions about methane, about shipping, about agriculture. There's a lot going on in the international space on climate that's beyond the UN climate talks. Could you put that kind of broader, put Baku in that kind of broader context for us and help us understand sort of where you think are some of the key themes moving forward on climate policy?
Sure, thanks so much. So I'm going to admit to being a bit of a COP skeptic, and let me lay out some of my skepticism, but I've kind of come around, not wholly to them, but I see some of the benefits, so I'm going to start with the negative and then try to end on a more positive note. So part of my skepticism comes from this idea that economists have formalized, which is something called cheap talk. It's kind of a catchy name for what is an intuitive principle, which is the idea that if you say something and there is no penalty for saying something that's not true, then people will say things that aren't true, basically, right? If there are no penalties for making commitments that you don't adhere to, then lots of people make commitments. And so my view of COPs has been, they completely invite cheap talk. That there are all these countries that are making nationally determined contributions and these lofty goals, and then they don't get to their goals, but there's no penalty for not achieving the goals. So I think that's kind of part of one of my skepticism, that the COPs are a lot about talk and people put a lot of emphasis on the words that come out. Like last year there was an emphasis on kind of transitioning away, I forget the exact phrasing, from fossil fuels. That was viewed as a big accomplishment. But those are just words. And my second is kind of a related critique or level of skepticism, is that I think that the COPs attract the climate ministers, the environment ministers, and not the finance ministers, not the people that kind of control economic incentives, and ultimately addressing climate change is an economic problem. So I think that the COPs kind of don't have the right people in the room. And lastly, I think that in some ways the strength of the UNFCCC process is also its weakness. And the strength is that they include, as Rob said, like basically every country in the world. And so countries like the Marshall Islands, population 37,000 people, not a third of the people of Cambridge live in Marshall Islands, but Marshall Islands is kind of a party to the COP. They can't hold it up, but they have a pretty, they're an island state that is potentially going to be overrun by rising sea levels, so they have kind of a voice there. So I guess I've been encouraging, partly through the Global Climate Policy Project that Joe mentioned, thinking beyond COP, thinking about kind of bilateral or multilateral type agreements that countries could raise to help address climate change. As a COP skeptic, I felt like I had to go to a COP, and so I went to Dubai last year, and I came away with kind of a more positive view of it. So let me highlight, I think, some of the positives. One is that it literally focuses the world's attention on climate change for 2 weeks every year. You see big names, the head of the IMF, the head of the WTO, and the head of the EU in 2023 put out an op-ed on climate during the COP. So it really is like, these are the 2 weeks in the year when we are going to think about climate change. And that also it provides a deadline. If you're thinking about something like the Global Methane Pledge and you want to make a big announcement, the COP period is the time to make that announcement. And so you don't delay, you have this deadline to do it. And also, as Rob said, it's a great conference. I went to Dubai, I had wonderful meetings with people that if I just went down to DC, I wouldn't have gotten the same level of meetings. And finally, I think incentives are important, economic incentives are important, but so is diplomacy, and so are optics, and so are pledges. So, I definitely think there's a role for COP. I think there's a role for other things that lean on the economic incentives a little harder. But yeah, I think we need to be cognizant of kind of the role that COP is playing and not expect too much from the COPs.
Thanks, Catherine. Rob, I want to turn to you next to discuss some of the big news that came out of Baku. They had, and I have to read this because it's not the most natural acronym. the new collective quantified goal, which I understand we now say is the NCQG. There's something about all those consonants, that doesn't roll off the tongue. But the NCQG, the new collective quantified goal, focusing on climate finance. As we already heard at this kind of finance COP, there's a lot of focus on this as sort of the next step from what had been originally agreed to all the way back in Copenhagen and enshrined in Paris. So help us understand, what is the NCQG? What did the countries actually agree on for this? And what do you think is left out or left unsaid in what was agreed to in Baku?
So I think a good way to think about fitting finance into this whole story is that there are sort of three elements you could think of in the international negotiations. One is the heart of it, which is mitigation, which is reducing emissions. That's largely what the Paris Agreement with the nationally determined contributions or the Kyoto Protocol before it was about. But there's recognition that even if emissions were reduced to zero tomorrow morning, I mean zero, not just cut, but zero, there's still going to be climate change. So the issue of adaptation comes up, and from the perspective of some countries, particularly the United States, that was what the $100 billion was really about, as opposed to helping with mitigation. And then there's this third level that most recently over the last 5 years, but even more so the last 2 years, is the reality you can't adapt for everything. The small island states, for example, that are going to go underwater, the adaptation is not feasible, it's existential. And that's what this other track of loss and damage is about. So the finance part, which nowadays is looked at as for mitigation as well, is essentially income transfers from the wealthier countries to the poorer countries, although I think that the way the poorer countries would look at it would not be to characterize it that way. They would say it is from those countries responsible for climate change, i.e. large contributions to the stock, which is going to be the United States, the European Union, China, Russia, and other countries dropping down quite a bit, to those countries who are vulnerable to climate change. So there was a $100 billion pledge in Copenhagen for 2020, $100 billion per year for 2020. I think in 2022 it was achieved, and then since then there's been a movement to try to get that increased, and that was said last year in Dubai that it would happen this year, that it would be increased. So this is the finance COP. So the countries who would receive, they wanted it to be $1.3 trillion per year. The countries who would be contributing, which doesn't include China, by the way, even though they're a massive contributor to stock, because China likes to use the 1992 rules from the United Nations that they're a developing country, so they don't contribute unless voluntarily, but everything is voluntary. And so the contributor countries wanted to be $300 billion per year by 2035, and that's what came out. The remaining contention, which I actually think is an important one, if this was really meaningful, because it is just aspirational, there aren't particular teeth on it. But if it were meaningful, the key question would be whether or not that's only foreign aid, government, which is what the recipient countries want, or whether the way it is much more likely to be able to be realized, and that's going to be including foreign direct investment. So, what private companies do in the poor countries that is good for climate change, largely for mitigation, but also adaptation. And that remains a controversy between the two sets of countries.
It may remain a controversy, but as someone who was part of the US delegation in 2009, it was a key point for us and for other countries to make sure that it is both public and private.
Right.
And there is a lot to try to think about how you can amplify that kind of private investment going forward. But it does raise questions about where does the money, is it coming through the private sector? Is it through bilateral support? Does it go through development banks or the Green Climate Fund?
Right.
So we talk about all these different ways of doing it, but of course the big question, as you noted, is who pays into this?
Yeah.
Angela and Adarsh, I'd like to go to you and get a sense from your perspective at the COP, how much of a discussion was there about whether we should expand the set of countries we should expect? There have been talks in the past that the countries that have large sovereign wealth funds, in part because of the wealth they've accumulated through exporting energy, some of that could be going to climate finance. We saw last year in Dubai, the UAE made a pledge to finance part of this new loss and damage fund. So we see a little bit of this deviation from what has been this bifurcation that Rob referenced since 1992, that we expect OECD countries to be donors, but the world has changed some in the last 30 some odd years. We'd love to hear your thoughts on sort of what you were hearing about, like, who should we expect to pay in to these funds?
Yeah, I think the three sort of pillars of this debate comes on the quantum of money, the quality of the finance, and also who the contributors are. So from the developed countries' perspective, it's, they would argue that it shouldn't just be us. The oil-rich Gulf should contribute. China, which now accounts for a third of emissions, should also contribute. Some have even said countries like India should start contributing. There's some valid arguments to be made for that. But the other sort of dimension to this is also the quality of financing. When you talk about the $100 billion Copenhagen agreement, it was reached in 2022 by some measures like from OECD, but reports from Oxfam say if you count just public finance and sort of concessional loans and grants, that comes to around $40 billion. Going back to Professor Wolfram's point, I think the only notable example of a finance minister that came to this COP was, I think, the Pakistan finance minister. And I think we can, of course, they have probably the country that struggled the most when it comes to climate damages, and they are in desperate need of climate funds, right? And so we see sort of the power sort of at play here in COP and who's attending and why some finance ministers are not attending. So the point that I want to make here is that countries like Pakistan are already struggling with an immense amount of debt. So when you talk about financing, it's not just the quantum that matters, even if you get to 300 billion. If a lot of that is coming at market interest rates with very high cost of capital, that's not really going to help solve the problem for countries that are already facing a lot of debt, that are already facing climate catastrophes. Going back to your example of the Loss and Damage Fund, one of the representatives of the Loss and Damage Fund, I had the pleasure of interacting with him, and he's actually at Harvard, and he sort of mentioned that pledges are one thing, but actual mobilization of funds is a whole other issue. And when I spoke with the developing country representatives from India, Rwanda, and other parts of the world, one of the complaints that they had was about how this financing takes a long, long time to really manifest into reality. If you think about multilateral development banks, if you want to get finance from one of these projects, you have to go through 2 or 3 years in order to actually get that amount of funding. And so that's a big, big challenge that I want to sort of draw attention to.
No, definitely echo everything that's been said. I also think, at least from where I was sitting, I was mostly working on some programming for the South Korean pavilion, so I was right next to the China pavilion, as well as like the Children and Youth pavilion. They're all in that general section. And I think that countries that are not currently within that OECD restriction don't really have the incentive to bring it up that they're not in that restriction, right? And so I think that when you look at the programming at those pavilions, they very hardly ever talk about that sort of element of it. They will bring into a lot of account the voluntary aspects that they are doing, for example, like solar panels, developing, etc. But I don't think that there is that incentive, right, as we talked about with economic incentives. And I also think that even for countries who are currently part of that OECD clause, that they also haven't been doing enough in communicating that we need to be expanding the scope, at least at the sort of side level event. And I think there needs to be a lot more coordinated public pressure to start to understand if we should be revising the scope of this gradient of who is actually required to contribute in order for anything to happen, because I think that this is sort of a neglected topic actually compared to how much impact it could proportionally have, especially even when you talk about other items on the agenda.
Thanks, Angela. Why is it a collective goal instead of a set of country-specific goals? So for emissions, we ask each country, and we'll get to this in a moment, to pledge their own emissions goal for 2030, or as we'll start to see, 2035. Why don't we do the same for finance?
Well,
Go ahead, no, you know.
no, I was just going to say that officially part of an NDC can be the financial contribution. But the NDCs are voluntary. Whether or not you're going to put that in NDC is voluntary, or whether you're going to comply with the NDC is voluntary. So.
I'd be curious to hear your take, but I guess I think it might embarrass the U.S. like how little we put in.
I don't think I'd say might.
Okay. So maybe that's why.
It is one of these things where, we did have in 2021 in Glasgow this kind of recognition that we had this goal that had been agreed to in 2009, repeated in 2010, repeated in 2015, to ramp up to 100 billion by 2020 of public and private finance, and we had not attained it. And I think the challenge is sort of, well, who's responsible then? And maybe you decide to agree on a collective goal because no one really wants to put their name down. Even if it's something that's voluntary, like an emissions goal, they don't want to sort of put their name down and say, we'll be on the hook for this amount. I also think it's not just that the US would be embarrassed. I think there's a concern that politically it could create a target for those who are opposed to the combination of foreign aid and efforts to address climate change. So I think there's some of that, but it's an interesting when we think about the different ways the international negotiations have evolved. We've now gotten to the point where virtually every country in the world puts forward an emissions goal. And we do have, as Rob noted, you could put in financing in this. And in fact, some countries say, conditional on receiving additional financial support, we could do more in our country to cut emissions. But I think among the traditional set of donor countries, there's just not that appetite to be able to sort of establish a country-specific measure, because I think of the potential domestic political implications of that.
I remember the global methane pledge, which is emissions, is itself collective, not by individual countries. And if you ask the leaders of that, which are the US and Europe, I remember discussing this at least a year ago, why wasn't there a set of individual pledges for countries? And the simple answer was, then we wouldn't have this large number of countries.
I mean, just to put things in a little perspective, so under the 100 billion pledge, I think the U.S. finally got up to like 12 billion out of that 100 billion. And as Angela said, some of that was, squishy. Should we really count it as part of the 12 billion? And the U.S. is what, like a quarter of cumulative emissions. It's the biggest economy in the world. It also passed the Inflation Reduction Act, which by a lot of calculations will spend 100 billion per year in U.S. investments in climate change. So yeah, to me, the fact that we're like struggling to get to 12 billion, 12% of this pledge is not something that we should be proud of.
Angela?
Yeah, I think I totally agree with the take that it's probably not like a lot of people would not sign on to it if it were very delineated as to like who was putting in what amount. But I think maybe the more positive read on it is that I think science is very clear as to what the pathways look like, and then I think we can generally translate that into how much financing is necessary. But the idea of who pays and for how much is, I think, ultimately a way more normative question. And so I do think that that maybe is just the first step, and then we should translate that into nationally determined contributions and things like that. But I think it makes sense that that would be the easier goal to first reach, but not that we should stop there.
Yeah. Josh, quickly, and then I'm going to talk about the road to Brazil.
Yeah, very quickly, I think in terms of who pays, it sort of comes from a consortium of developed countries, and a lot of that sort of actualizes through multilateral development banks. So the quantum that's been agreed on is $300 billion. Sort of going back to the Climate Expo point, one of the big announcements from multilateral development banks, which includes World Bank, AIIB, ADB, etc., was that they want to contribute around $120 billion by 2030 and then mobilize private finance of $65 billion. That gets you to $185 billion. So depending on how much of that counts towards the $300 billion, which I think is the vast majority, more than half at least is coming from multilateral development banks.
Okay, thanks. So as we look towards Brazil in 2025, in the first quarter of this coming year, I think we can expect at least two things related to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. First, countries will submit their nationally determined contributions. So these are the voluntary emission goals that countries identify for the year 2035. And second, I think most people expect that President Trump will withdraw from the Paris Agreement again. And this will occur after we've already had a little bit of displeasure among a number of other countries with the UNFCCC process. We had Papua New Guinea and Argentina withdraw their delegations from Baku. So I want to ask first a question about the vibes. What's kind of our sense of the feeling that you drew from your conversations in the atmosphere in Baku? Rob, how would you describe the vibes?
So I think those that are skeptical, and I'm not indicting you at all, but people that are very skeptical of the international process, I'm actually thinking of some people I work with in Europe. Their takeaway, this is evidence that it's not going anywhere. Those people who are really engaged in the process, there wasn't a broad feeling of that. There was broad feelings of that in previous other periods. I remember there was almost a walkout at one of the two times it's been held in Warsaw. Developing countries came very, very close. I guess did start to actually physically walk out. Also after Copenhagen, because the expectations were high, so therefore it's all relative to expectations, so there was a lot of disappointment, and there was a lot of hand-wringing within the hallways and beginning to think about, gee, should we think about more about the G20, the MEF, the whole set of alternatives that exist. Frankly, I didn't see it this time, and I think one of the reasons is that, again, is expectations. The expectations were very low for this COP, and therefore there isn't a great reaction of disappointment. So, for example, as Catherine pointed out, what was held up, I think incorrectly, but what was held up as the great success in Dubai was this statement in the closing document of transitioning away from fossil fuels. So the big debate at the last second was to go beyond that, to make it stronger. And not only did they not make it stronger, they didn't even endorse it, they just sort of referenced it, which in diplomacy, as you well know, are very important differences in language. But there wasn't, I didn't see, tremendous disappointment in the press's takeaway the way you might have anticipated.
Josh, what's your take on the vibes?
Good vibes. I was scared going. I went for week 2, and that's when all the news came out of France leaving and all these countries leaving, and so I felt for a second that I might be going to a party that's like where everyone's already left and I'll be the only one there. But no, it was the opposite case. I think going to the first point Angela made, I think for me a good source of energy and knowledge also was the youth. I did not expect the sheer amount of participation from youth going in. This was my first COP. And so I struggled the entire week with jet lag. I'm not as seasoned as you all with sort of international travel, but I think apart from the morning caffeine boost, engaging with youth I found to be very inspiring. When I would go to their morning sessions, they would have these they would end with sort of a beautiful chant that they would do together, like a song. And so I think overall great vibes to answer your question. But I think for me, given my personal interest is really in food and agriculture, and there's a phenomenal amount of activity on that topic, I found myself to be very sort of recharged throughout the week. Yeah.
Great. Angela?
Yeah, definitely. A couple of thoughts here. This year I went to New York Climate Week for the very first time, and actually the most common phrase I heard at New York Climate Week was, no, I won't be in Baku, but definitely Brazil. And so I think that was my understanding of the vibes going into Baku, but also into COP30. And so I think that informed a lot of the justifications for other people not going to COP29 as well. They're like, oh, like a lot of our network isn't going, so why would we be there? And I think that sort of was also demonstrated in like ministerial turnout, etc. But I also think that in terms of the vibes, as you may say, I think I think there was a lot of energy from those who were there, because I think you're sort of selecting for people who are still committed to going in, and so I think they were trying to bring more of that momentum forward, which I really appreciated and respected. Like COPs, like 2 weeks is a really long time, and especially after the negotiations, there's always like a lot of tears, a lot of drama, and so I think like overall, it was still a COP, like it still met a lot of that energy that I expected going into it.
Catherine, so while everyone else in the panel was able to check off Baku on their bucket list, you checked off Barbados on your bucket list, and I'm not judging anyone on the panel, but I'm curious, given your participation in this meeting in Barbados, maybe you can share a little bit about that with us and give us a sense of the vibes there and how we think about climate policy from these broader engagements that are addressing energy and climate and security issues.
Sure, so let me first say something about the vibes around Azerbaijan, not having been there, but in part I think this was why a lot of people weren't there and it hasn't come up yet. So Azerbaijan, to be frank, is kind of a two-bit economy. I don't know where it is in the world rank, but it is a major oil and gas exporter. I looked it up yesterday, 90% of their export revenues are oil and gas. 60% of its finances are oil and gas. The COP president was also the president of the state oil company of the Azerbaijan Republic, and notably was like doing oil and gas deals at COP. So I think that was a vibe kill. I'm guessing that was part of the bad vibes. And so I think Brazil, it's a very clean economy. Brazil, for a lot of reasons, will change that vibe. So yes, I did end up having to go to Barbados for a conference and experience the lovely waters and lovely beaches in Barbados. I think one reason that I went to Barbados is the Prime Minister of Barbados, Mia Mottley, has been very, very forward-leaning on climate finance. And she launched what's called the Bridgetown Initiative. I don't follow the whole history, but I think she is like very, very responsible for putting these numbers, the 1.3 trillion, for making those the headline numbers and not having people kind of over anchor on the 100 billion. So she is somebody who has kind of used her platform and is a very powerful, very persuasive speaker, and she's used that to really highlight the importance of climate finance. Also at the conference that I was at was the IMF, and to Adarsh's point, the IMF has been quite creative about using kind of elaborate financial techniques and putting as collateral this special drawing rights, and it has created this, I think, about $50 billion resilience and climate trust. So yeah, I definitely think that there are roles for people like Mia Mottley to bring attention to things, and has definitely had an impact on places like the IMF.
Great. So when we look forward as well, we've heard from President-elect Trump that he likes the word tariffs. We know in other parts of the world, like in the EU, they have begun to implement a carbon border adjustment mechanism. So they're already collecting the necessary information. They'll start to collect payments in just more than a year from now. So that if you are producing an energy-intensive good in your home economy and that production doesn't face the same carbon price as what your competitors located in the EU face, you then have to pay to export into the EU to sort of buy allowances to be kept on par with the regulatory compliance obligation of those domestic manufacturers within the EU. We hear about the UK doing this. We're seeing how this is starting to inform how countries are responding to what the EU is doing, and there's discussion in the US Congress about whether or not to do something along these lines as well. So we've got this sort of UNFCCC process, which despite some efforts in the past hasn't really meaningfully addressed trade in the context of formal negotiations and decisions. How do we think about the role of trade in forming what kind of actions countries may take over the coming year, how it might inform how we think about international finance as well? Perhaps, Catherine, since you've been doing a lot of work in this space, you could start us off to help sort of frame what is this kind of emerging bilateral or small plurilateral discussion about climate and trade, and how it is either going to complement and amplify what we're trying to do in the UNFCCC process, or how it might hinder some of that progress.
Yeah, so I think that at a very high level, the economics of climate change are quite straightforward, but daunting. And so I think the simple economics of climate change are that it's a global problem. If we had a globally elected president or a global czar, it would be so easy. They would just put on a global carbon price, and that would lead to reduction in emissions. If that president was a czar, I guess if they were popularly elected, maybe it would be harder. But we're not in that setting. We have individual countries making decisions and facing their own political constraints. And so one of the fundamental aspects of climate change is that every country would like to do maybe a little bit on climate change, maybe nothing, and let other countries do more, right? It's a classic kind of free rider problem, or a classic prisoner's dilemma problem, that no country wants to kind of be the lead, expend a lot of money with subsidies, or go through a lot of political pain, and reduce their emissions, because everyone else is just gonna kind of free ride on them. And so I think that trade and things like the carbon border adjustment mechanism that Joe just described are the first real policy that takes on that free rider aspect of climate change, and basically says, if you're gonna try to free ride, if you're gonna try not to reduce your carbon emissions, you're gonna pay a price. Like, if you try to export to countries that are ambitious in climate and that are putting on border adjustments, you're gonna pay a higher tariff. And so this is an idea that Nordhaus, a Nobel Prize winner in economics, has put forward, kind of this climate club idea. Let's get a bunch of countries that are willing to be ambitious on climate, have a punitive tariff if you're not part of the club, and hopefully kind of incentivize lots of countries, because they don't want to face that punitive tariff, to join the club. So, you know, I think the CBAM, as I've said, it's real, it's law, and I think it has the ability to kind of nudge us into a better outcome. I think, I don't know, sticks and tariffs and like the threat of facing tariffs aren't the only thing. I think an ideal club would also layer in some climate finance, kind of rewards, carrots for joining the club. You know, ideally coordination on technology development, but yeah, I think probably the way to establish something like that is through a series of smaller conversations with individual groups of countries, and not in a big, you know, 190 country setting.
So, Rob, I want to go back to a point you raised earlier about methane. Right, so what Catherine's described is something where if we get into sort of the right dynamic and the right equilibrium, we can think about how the use of trade policy could amplify efforts to reduce emissions. You made a reference to the global methane pledge. We're seeing more and more interest and action on methane, as, especially last year in Dubai, we heard oil and gas companies pledging to cut their methane emissions from their operations. You lead the Salada Institute's cluster project on methane that engages, you can tell me, I don't know, almost 24 faculty from all across the university, across an array of disciplines. What is it about methane right now where we see, whether it's through advances in some of the relevant technology for being able to detect leaks, some of the opportunities for cutting emissions, why do we see this as an opportunity to really push aggressively in cutting emissions of methane right now?
So, you know, the three principal sources of methane are the oil and gas sector, agriculture, which is both livestock and rice paddies, and then landfills. And in some countries, including the United States, the oil and gas sector is a major source of emissions. So if we focus for the moment, to address your question, just on the oil and gas sector, then we're looking at leaks. We're looking at leaks coming from abandoned or existing wellheads, from pumps and pipelines. And if you fix the leak, then you're keeping more of a merchantable product in the pipeline called natural gas. And so therefore it can pay for itself. Now it turns out that those leaks that are profitable to fix are fixed. I was in Doha probably 2, maybe 3 years ago, meeting with Qatar energy officials because of our methane work. So I was there for other reasons, but I wanted to meet with them to talk about methane. And so a group came into this conference room at the company where I was waiting for them, and I told them I was interested in methane, and they have a relatively low methane intensity compared to countries such as Far Eastern Europe and Asia. And their methane intensity is very low per unit of natural gas production. So I said, how did you accomplish this? And then they proceeded to tell me that it had absolutely nothing to do with climate change. It was that 10, maybe it was 12 years earlier, the CEO had said, we've got to improve margins across the board, every element of what we're doing. And of course, one of the things that they looked at to increase profits is to, cut down on leaks, and they have done a very good job of it. So the cost of why we're not seeing it more, why it's not happening everywhere to the full extent, is because you've got to find the leaks. So there are search costs, and some of the analyses that you and I have reviewed as one of the projects of the Methane Initiative, together with Forrest Reinhardt. In fact, we have seen that there are a lot of estimates that say there's so much free that could be achieved, because it would pay for itself. But a lot of those estimates don't include the search cost. What is a great source of optimism going forward is that new satellite technologies, including EDF's methane sat, which is going to begin to provide public information by now, I guess they're saying the beginning of next year, this coming year, 2025. That's essentially reducing search costs tremendously because it's providing the information to the oil and gas companies. Now that doesn't help with abandoned sites in Pennsylvania, but it will make a big difference. And so at least in the oil and gas sector, that's why there were so many people from big oil at the COP last year, was because of the fact that it can pay for itself. That doesn't necessarily translate into CO2 emissions reduction, so it's not the ultimate gift.
Thanks, Rob. So before I open it up for questions from the audience, I'm going to go to Angela and Adarsh. They were two of, I think, about 10 students who the Salada Institute supported in attending the COP this year in Baku. When you think about what we can do going forward to either cut emissions or reduce human suffering from climate change, Angela, I'll start with you. What gives you optimism that we can make meaningful progress on one of those two margins in the context of international climate policy?
Yeah, definitely. I think one really interesting aspect of the intersection of those two goals that you mentioned is that I think often they relate to one another. And so I think a lot of countries, especially in the developing world, are intentionally focused on solutions that address both climate action but also other sustainable development goals. They're trying to diversify their economies in ways that are profitable for their local communities but also reduce their emissions targets and things like that. And so I think because we frame it with the other SDGs in mind, there's already a lot of a strong framework for making that target complementary. And then I think also, I think I faced a lot of skepticism even from a lot of other young people about going to COPs, about oh, you're flying all this way and for what? And so I think that that's something that I've been thinking a lot about recently, but I think I still go back year after year because I realize, and I think this is a point that Professor Wolfram made, that this is the main convening in which people have a deadline. They have to report back as to what they do in this year, and so I think that's meaningful alone. But even if that's not meaningful, I think it's important, especially for marginalized constituencies, so young people, indigenous people, other representative groups, to have some sort of seat at the table. And this is one of the closest ways that we can get to it. By being at COP, you're able to meet with a lot of high-level negotiators who I think would not give me the time of day otherwise, because that is the one opportunity and window where you can sort of push and remind them of why they're here and why we're all trying to do all this good work. And so I think that those are some things that give me a lot of optimism going forward.
Great. Thanks, Angela. Adarsh?
Yeah, I want to second Angela's point about you have to make progress on both margins, the climate aspect as well as the development aspect. And one theme that stood out for me in my conversations and the periphery was sort of the importance of integrated solutions. So especially say in the food and ag context, if you're not just thinking about solutions like regenerative farming on mitigation, but it's also an adaptation solution. It's also a solution to potentially boost farmers' incomes. There's a lot of women involved in smallholder agriculture, so there's a gender component as well. So really, I think so far a lot of the approach to global problem solving has been sort of firefighter and arsonist. where you try to solve, say, issues like yields, or trying to solve food security in sort of through solutions like monoculture cropping, and sort of that sort of has its costs on biodiversity. It sort of reduces water tables in areas like Punjab in India, and so you're solving one problem, you're just shifting the dirt from one side of the carpet to the other. And sort of going forward, especially if we all agree that the amount of resources or the amount of financing is limited, it's even more incumbent upon us to ensure that whatever dollars we spend and use, try to address all these solutions in one go, so that 20 years down the line, it's not that we've solved one problem and just shifted the burden to another one.
Okay. Thanks, Adarsh. So we'll take questions from the audience. I appreciate if you raise your hand. I'll call on you. I would like for you to identify yourself and then frame your question in the form of a question. I'll briefly repeat it for the benefit of those who are watching the recording. Vrinda in the back.
Hi, thanks so much for this panel. This is excellent. I'm so glad that you guys went because some of these insights are really wonderful. My question was more on, as someone, my name is Brenda. I am an MPP1, sorry, thank you. My question was more on this idea of blended finance, given that this was the climate finance COP. I want to understand your level of hope or skepticism around sort of building blended finance structures in which you sort of incentivize corporates to step up and sort of start financing, given that it is about 55 billion of the entire pledge. And if you're sort of hopeful about that, or do you think it's just a bit of a pop-up from like governments to shift sort of responsibility onto the private sector with no real structure in place to be able to manage that?
So Brinda's question focuses on blended finance, the opportunity of engaging both public and private sources of finance, how we can think about leveraging those kinds of investments from the private sector. Is this simply a cop-out from various governments to sort of push the problem onto the private sector? Or do you think that there are opportunities to really structure how we move forward in blended finance in a way to really ramp up this source of monies for climate adaptation and mitigation?
So I think that there are real opportunities. I mean, we've seen them in the past. So for example, the Obama administration, the policy that was put forward, which passed the House, didn't make its way into the Senate, actually included within it a provision for what they were looking at as offsets, which was going to, from developing countries, which at the time there were calculations, and they're huge, what the estimates were of the amount of foreign direct investment for emissions reductions in developing countries would be from that. So I think that is a potential mechanism. Now there's a downside of that, is that those are offsets, emission reduction credits, and there's this huge issue of additionality that is virtually always there with an offset mechanism. Having said that, we could see it. Within the Paris Agreement, the opportunity for that is Article 6, because Article 6 is a way of, you can think of Article 6.4 is essentially trying to encourage that in developing countries. Article 6.2 as probably more among the wealthier countries, but of carrying out investment activities.
Yeah, just to add to that, I think it's a fundamental problem of like amount of capital. I don't think there's enough public finance available, and even if there is, I guess there's not enough willingness to deploy all of that towards what's actually required. What's required is at the very least $1.3 trillion. You do need private capital to fill that vacuum. And that's where blended finance, is a pretty creative solution, right? Because to get private sector investors in, they have some expectations on return and risk. Climate investments are inherently a bit more risky, and therefore, by leveraging public finance through MDBs and other sources, you can structure it such that, or philanthropies as well, such that they can say take the first loss and sort of mitigate some of the risks, so that you can incentivize private players to sort of step in and contribute the amount of sort of capital that's actually required.
Yeah, I was in a shuttle, and the lady who happened to sit next to me was like BlackRock's like climate infrastructure fund head, and we just started having this conversation. And I just happened to learn that I think there's a lot of thought, and specifically in family funds and philanthropies, as to how that can happen at the like even grassroots level, like even without those who engage with COPs. And so I actually left that conversation feeling a lot more optimistic. To answer your question about like where it sort of sits at COP, like I don't think it was like maybe like the main topic in terms of like there's just not a lot of family funds and philanthropies present. I think some of the big ones like Rockefeller are there, but I still think that there's a lot of movement on the ground there.
Great, thanks. Yes, in the back, please.
I'm Sky Yoden, I'm a PhD student. I had a question about basically, I was talking to someone who was advising a sovereign fund in Norway, and they were trying to grapple with how much to invest in climate change pledges and how much to invest in the Ukraine war, which they see as an existential threat to their borders. And I was curious if you talk about financing, like how geopolitical conflict, the rising risk of geopolitical conflict plays into these conversations and into how countries are showing up.
Okay, so the question focuses on how do we think about, in a sense, a number of potential claims on our resources. There's the potential to, in this example, of thinking about how a sovereign wealth fund could allocate some of its investment, could be for climate, could also help address concerns like the Ukraine war, which is a critical issue in Europe. How do we think about, with the evolving geopolitics, how that may influence the interests and availability of resources to tackle climate change?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'll try to be optimistic on this one. I think one thing that the Ukraine war showed us was how easy it was for Europe to kind of transition away from its reliance on Russian natural gas and how flexible their economy was. There were a lot of very dire predictions at the beginning of the invasion about, just how bad it would be for Europe's economy with Russia potentially cutting off the gas, or with the EU not wanting to import gas from Russia. But there have been a number of economic studies that have shown that they were very, very resilient. I mean, I was in the U.S. government. There were predictions about just dire consequences. Maybe not the first year, because they'd be able to store a lot of gas, but then going through the summer would be hard, and the next year was going to be really dire, but that just has not materialized. So I think that's an indication that's optimistic for the clean energy transition, about kind of the flexibility of economies.
Maybe the only thing I'll add to that, so sorry, is that I think the decision to host it in Azerbaijan is ultimately a political decision that Russia had a lot of influence in. So I think these geopolitical considerations frame a lot of the context. Similarly, when we were talking about vibes, I was very remiss to forget to mention that whenever I said I was American, people were like, oh, like there was just a lot of questions around the U.S. election and if that would serve differences in geopolitics. So to answer that question, I think that's one framing, and then the other framing is I think Al Gore loves to say political capital is a renewable resource or something like that, or energy for the climate battle is a renewable resource. And I think, at least in a lot of the more grassroots movements, a lot of the maybe more activist movements, I think Israel-Palestine has definitely split a lot of the movement down the middle, and we definitely saw that at protests at COP as well.
Thanks. Yes, please.
I'm Avni. I'm a master's in urban planning student. My question is around making a legal and binding framework for climate finance, and the context is, I believe last week there's some hearings that have started in the International Court of Justice where Vanuatu has basically a case for making historic emitters and high emitters pay for this. So the first part of the question is, would that even work, even if, let's say, there is a ruling in favor of Vanuatu? Is that implementable, a legal framework that is binding? And within that, is there a role for, or is there an argument for historic emitters to pay for this?
Okay, so the question focuses on this current international legal case brought by a small Pacific Island state against major emitters to try to hold them liable for the damages associated with climate change. Could such a system, could such a process actually yield an outcome which legally binds countries to compensate for the harms they've imposed on others through their emissions of greenhouse gases?
So obviously, I'm an economist, not a lawyer, so I'm going to leave it up to the international law scholars, maybe who are here or certainly at Harvard Law School, to answer the question of legal bindingness there. But what I will say is, from our experience in the Conference of the Parties, we learned something important, and that is the Loss and Damage Fund. Because the Loss and Damage Fund is all about the rich countries paying developing countries and the most vulnerable of those countries. And there were huge concerns, and that was viewed as absolutely essential, as you can understand it by the island states, absolutely essential, non-negotiable. The countries that had contributed to the stock, to a large degree, except for China, since they exercise the name of developing country to not be part of it, their view was that this is going to lead to international legal liability, and so it's absolutely unacceptable. So you had, a distribution of views which was not going to lead to an outcome. That was finessed in the Paris Agreement in a very interesting way. So an article of the Paris Agreement itself says loss and damage is very, very important. And then Article 52 of the decision that refers back to that all 195 countries signed off on, says, but it is not a basis for legal liability or compensation. So that's a non-existence proof that it's not going to go anywhere. I agree with so much of what Catherine said, but we should remember that putting in place a sanction, a requirement, a penalty, may be a necessary, but it's not a sufficient condition. So the Kyoto Protocol had such sanctions in it, and the result of that is when push came to shove, and they were going to have to pay the penalties, Canada dropped out, Japan dropped out, Russia dropped out. The United States, of course, for that reason, never ratified it. Everyone dropped out except the European Union and New Zealand. 14% of global emissions. That was what remained at the end for the Kyoto Protocol. So, I agree with the principles and the sentiments behind this completely. But in terms of feasibility, I would be very skeptical.
So I'm mindful of the time, and I know there are some additional questions, so what I encourage you is to come up and join us after we wrap up during the mingling session for questions that you may have for specific panelists here. Before we wrap, I'd like to thank Amy Sisson and Una Gaffney for all of their support for this event, two of our colleagues at the Salata Institute. And finally, please join me in thanking Rob, Catherine, Angela, and Adarsh for their insights and perspectives today. Thank you guys.